The address glowed wrong on my phone screen, but I was already 20 minutes late and my manager would dock my pay if I took any longer, so I pushed through the gleaming lobby doors of the high-rise anyway, pizza bags balanced against my hip, the heat seeping through my thin jacket. The doorman barely glanced at me, used to delivery people invading his polished domain, and I slipped into the elevator before he could question whether I belonged in this building, where the monthly rent probably exceeded my yearly income. Floor 28. The hallway smelled like expensive candles and money, thick carpet muffling my worn sneakers, and I checked the receipt again because something felt off, but I was too exhausted to care. 3 jobs, and not enough sleep blurring everything into survival mode. I knocked on 2804, waited, heard movement inside. The door opened and my breath caught because the man standing there was shirtless. All carved muscle and dark ink swirling across his chest and shoulders, and his eyes were gray like winter storms, cold and assessing in a face too handsome to be safe. He looked annoyed, eyebrows drawn together, mouth set in a hard line. But then his gaze dropped to my hands as I reached for the pizza bags, and everything changed. The air itself shifted. His entire body went still in a way that reminded me of predators on nature documentaries, that focused intensity right before the strike, and I realized he was staring at my wrist where my sleeve had ridden up, exposing the finger-shaped bruises Derek left last night. Those gray eyes snapped back to my face, and I wanted to run, but my feet would not move. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, controlled. But something deadly moved underneath the calm. I pulled my sleeve down fast, too fast, stammering that it was nothing. I bruised easily. I just needed payment for the pizza. He did not move from the doorway, did not blink. Asked again who put those marks on me and I lied, said I was clumsy, bumped into things. Please, I needed to go. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt stripped bare under that gaze, like he could see every secret I buried, every excuse I made, every time I covered bruises with makeup and long sleeves. Then he stepped back, pulled out his wallet, handed me bills without counting. Way too much, easily triple the order cost. "Keep it." His voice was softer now, but no less intense. I tried to give back the extra, but he closed my fingers around the money, his hand warm and solid and careful not to touch the bruises. And then he took the receipt and wrote something on it before handing it back. "My personal number. When you are ready." I shook my head, said I did not need anything. "Thank you for the tip." And finally my legs remembered how to work. I turned toward the elevator, skin prickling because I knew without looking that he watched me, felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, and when the elevator doors finally closed, I sagged against the wall, heart hammering. Something about him terrified me. Something about him felt like salvation. I should throw away the receipt. I tucked it into my pocket instead. The apartment door stuck like it always did, and I had to shoulder it open, the sound loud enough to wake Derek if he was sleeping, but I found him awake instead, sprawling on our sagging couch with empty beer bottles lined up on the coffee table like soldiers, his eyes tracking me as I entered, and my stomach dropped because I knew that look, that dangerous, glassy focus that meant he had been drinking and thinking and nothing good ever came from that combination. "You took forever." His voice was too calm, the kind of calm that preceded storms. I checked the receipt times and my pulse started hammering because I had taken 47 minutes for a delivery that should have been 20. Too long, way too long. And I scrambled for excuses about traffic and wrong addresses, but he was already standing, swaying slightly, closing the distance between us. "Who were you with?" "Nobody. Just deliveries. My manager sent me across town." I tried to keep my voice level and soothing, the tone I used when he got like this. But he grabbed my arm exactly where the bruises already lived, and white-hot pain exploded up to my shoulder. I gasped, could not stop the sound, and something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, before he accused me of cheating, said I smelled different, looked different, was lying to him. I tried to pull away, and he shoved me backward into the kitchen counter, the edge catching my hip bone, and I tasted fear metallic and familiar. He loomed over me, demanding to know who I was seeing, what I was doing, why I was destroying us, and I made myself small, made myself apologize for things I did not do, agreed that I should have been faster, promised nothing was wrong, anything to diffuse this. He stared at me for a long moment, and I held my breath. Then he released me with a sound of disgust and stumbled back to the couch, reaching for another beer. I did not wait to see if his mood would shift again, just walked quickly to the bathroom, locked the door with shaking hands, and slid down to sit on the cold tile floor. Through the thin door, I heard him muttering, then the television blaring too loud, then eventually his snoring, that particular rattling sound that meant he passed out drunk. I should have felt relief, but instead, I just felt hollow, scooped out, until I remembered the receipt still crumpled in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out, smoothed it against my knee, stared at the number written in strong, confident strokes. A stranger's number. A dangerous man's number. Why did his concern feel safer than my own home? I could not answer that, but I tucked the receipt into my bra, against my heart, and tried not to think about gray eyes that saw too much. Sleep would not come. I lay in the bathtub with a pillow and blanket, door still locked, and replayed every second of that doorway encounter, the way Alexander's entire body had gone still when he saw my bruises, the deadly quiet in his voice, the careful way he had not touched the marks when he pressed money into my hand. Something about him promised violence, but not toward me. Never toward me. That certainty should not have existed after one meeting, but it lived in my chest anyway, warm and terrifying and impossible to ignore. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and fryer grease, familiar and suffocating in equal measure, and I moved through my shift on autopilot, exhaustion dragging at my bones because I had not slept more than 2 hours. Every noise in the apartment jerking me awake in case Derek changed his mind about passing out. I wore long sleeves despite the oppressive heat, the fabric sticking to my skin, hiding the evidence written across my arms in shades of purple and yellow, and my manager Denise had already given me the look, that pinched expression that said she noticed but would not ask because asking meant getting involved. The lunch rush thinned to scattered customers, truckers and elderly couples and teenagers cutting class. And I refilled coffee mugs and delivered plates of eggs and pancakes while my mind replayed gray eyes and careful hands and a phone number I should have thrown away but kept instead, pressed against my heart like a talisman. The bell above the door chimed, and I glanced up automatically, then froze because a black luxury car was pulling into the parking lot outside, sleek and predatory among the rusted sedans and pickup trucks, completely out of place in this neighborhood where everything was tired and worn down. My heart started hammering before I even saw him emerge from the vehicle, tall and commanding in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, moving with that controlled grace that marked him as dangerous. And when Alexander Tremayne walked through the diner door, every conversation seemed to pause, people sensing without understanding that an apex predator had entered their space. His eyes found mine immediately, something flickering in that winter gray, when he saw me in my stained uniform and cheap sneakers, and he walked to my section, slid into a booth by the window, waited. I grabbed a menu with shaking hands and approached, hyper-aware of Denise watching from behind the counter, of the other waitress Amy staring openly, of how badly I did not belong in the same universe as this man. "Coffee," he said when I reached the table, his voice quiet and even, and when our eyes met I felt stripped bare again, exposed, like he could catalog every sleepless hour and every flinch I had hidden. I poured his coffee, tried to keep my hands steady, asked if he wanted anything else, and he said, "Why did you not call me?" I pretended not to understand, said I did not know what he meant, turned to leave, but his hand moved across the table and covered mine. Not trapping, just touching, warm and solid and steadying. And I stopped breathing. He held my gaze and slid a business card across the table with his other hand. Explained in that same quiet voice that it was a security company. They helped women in difficult situations, resources and protection for people who needed to disappear. I pulled my hand back and lied, said I was fine, everything was fine. He did not need to worry about a stranger. But he leaned back and studied me with something almost like sadness in his expression. "You are a terrible liar, Clara." Hearing my name and his voice did something to my chest, made it hard to pull in air, and I realized he had learned it somehow, had found out who I was, and that should have terrified me, but instead I felt seen in a way that made my eyes burn. He told me when I was ready, call the number. Someone would answer any time, day or night, and then he stood and placed 2 20s on the table for a $3 coffee, and walked out before taking a single sip, leaving me standing there with the business card burning in my pocket, and my heart racing, and the certainty that everything had just shifted again, tilted further towards something I could not take back. My break came 45 minutes later, and I disappeared into the back storage room with my phone, hands still shaking from the weight of the business card burning in my apron pocket. And I opened the browser and typed Alexander Tremayne into the search bar, my thumb hovering over the enter button for a long moment, because part of me knew that once I looked, once I confirmed what my instincts were already screaming, everything would become real and irreversible. The search results loaded, and I scrolled through them with my heart climbing into my throat, finding nothing concrete at first. Just a few mentions in society pages about charity galas and business acquisitions, a photo of him in a tuxedo looking devastating and untouchable at some fundraiser. But then I found the forums, the rabbit holes where people whispered about things they could not prove, threads about the Tremayne family controlling half the organized crime in the city, about Alexander taking over the empire at 19 after his father died, in what was officially ruled a heart attack, but unofficially understood as an execution, about territory and gambling and protection rackets and violence delivered with surgical precision. I delivered pizza to a mafia boss. The words repeated in my head like a prayer or a curse, and my stomach twisted because he knew where I worked, knew my name, had tracked me down after one encounter, and that kind of reach spoke to resources and power that should have sent me running. Except he also offered help, extended his hand when he had no reason to care about some broken waitress with bruises she tried to hide. My phone buzzed and I nearly dropped it. Saw Derek's name flash across the screen, the first of what would become 15 texts over the next 2 hours. Starting with, "Where are you?" Then escalating to "Who are you with?" and "You better not be ignoring me," and "I know you are hiding something," then the whiplash shift to "Baby, I am sorry about last night, and I love you, and please talk to me, and why are you doing this to us?" The pattern was so familiar it made me nauseous. This cycle I had lived through 100 times, his anger followed by remorse, followed by suspicion, followed by promises, spinning endlessly until I could not remember which version of him was real or if any of them were. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and returned to the floor, but Denise caught my arm as I passed, her grip firm and her expression tight. "You have been distracted all day, Clara. I cannot have you messing up orders or ignoring customers. You are on thin ice here." Her words hit like a slap, because I could not afford thin ice, could not afford to lose another job when I had already lost 3 in the past 6 months. Twice because Derek showed up drunk and caused scenes that got me fired for bringing personal drama to work. Once because I called in sick too many times after he hurt me badly enough that I could not hide it. I promised Denise it would not happen again, painted on my customer service smile, and finished the shift moving through motions while my mind spun between a dangerous man who saw me and a boyfriend who owned me, and the terrible knowledge that I had just looked into shadows I could never unsee. Derek arrived home at 6 p.m. sober for the first time in a week, and that fact alone put me on edge because his patterns were predictable and sobriety was not part of them. And when he walked through the door carrying grocery store flowers wrapped in crinkled plastic, carnations dyed garish pink. I felt my stomach clench with the familiar dread that came with his apology cycles. "Baby, I am so sorry about last night," he said, and his eyes were clear but red-rimmed like he had been crying, and he set the flowers on the counter and reached for me carefully like I might bolt. I let him hold me because resistance cost more energy than I had left. Let him murmur promises into my hair about how it would never happen again, how he was going to get help, how he loved me more than anything, the same script I had heard 100 times, with only minor variations in word choice and tone. We ate the dinner he brought home, Chinese takeout from the place on 5th Street, and the silence between us felt like glass, fragile and sharp, both of us moving carefully around the edges of what had happened the night before. He asked about my shift, and I told him it was fine, busy, nothing special, and I did not mention the black luxury car or gray eyes or the business card that was still hidden in my apron pocket at the bottom of my bag, because some instinct older than thought told me that information would detonate whatever temporary peace we had constructed. After dinner, I showered, let the hot water pound against my shoulders until the small bathroom filled with steam, and when I came out wrapped in a towel, Derek was sitting on the bed holding my phone, and the expression on his face made my blood turn to ice. "Who is Michael?" he asked, and his voice was too quiet, too controlled, and I realized with sickening clarity that he had gone through my contacts while I was in the shower, had seen Alexander's number that I had saved under a fake name, because some part of me knew even then that I might need it, might need him. "Just a customer from the diner," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to project the exhaustion and resignation that usually made Derek back down. But something was different tonight. Something in him had shifted past the point where my surrender would satisfy. "You are lying," he said, standing up, and the phone looked small in his hand, fragile. "Why would a customer give you his personal number? Why would you save it?" I tried to explain, said some people left numbers for carry-out orders, that it did not mean anything, but he was not listening anymore, his face flushing red the way it always did before the violence came. "Whore," he spat, and the word hit like a fist before his actual hand did, cracking across my face hard enough that I tasted copper. Felt my lips split open again in almost the same place as the half-healed cut from 2 nights ago. He started crying immediately, the rage collapsing into sobbing apologies, reaching for me, but I was already moving, grabbing my phone from where he had dropped it, backing toward the bedroom, and when he lunged after me, I slammed the door and locked it with shaking hands. I heard him collapse against the wall outside, heard him crying and pleading, and I sat on the floor with my back against the door and my split lip bleeding onto my shirt, and pulled up Alexander's number, and at 2 a.m., when the apartment finally went silent and I could hear Derek snoring on the couch, I typed one word and hit send. "Help." The response came in 30 seconds, just one word glowing on my cracked phone screen in the darkness of the locked bedroom. Address. My hands shook so badly I could barely type out the street name and apartment number, each letter a commitment I could not take back, and the moment I hit send, his reply came through with the same terrifying efficiency. 20 minutes. Do not engage. Stay in locked room. I stared at those words and felt something shift inside me, some final tether to my old life snapping clean, because I was really doing this, really letting a man I had met once, a dangerous man, whose world operated in shadows and violence, come to my apartment in the middle of the night to handle my problems in ways I could not let myself imagine too clearly. I moved on autopilot after that, pulling my battered duffel bag from the closet and stuffing clothes into it without caring what I grabbed, adding my laptop and the small lockbox with my birth certificate and social security card, the only documents Derek had not found and destroyed during one of his rages, and I worked in silence with my ear pressed to the door, listening to his snores rattling from the couch, thick and wet with alcohol and sleep. 18 minutes after I sent the address, I heard it, a knock so soft against the apartment door that I almost thought I imagined it, and I crept out of the bedroom with my heart hammering against my ribs, stepping over the creaking floorboard near the hallway that always woke Derek. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Alexander standing in the dingy corridor that suddenly looked too small to contain him, and beside him was another man, equally tall, equally dangerous. Both of them dressed in dark clothes that seemed to swallow the flickering fluorescent light. I opened the door, and Alexander's eyes went straight to my face, tracking over the swelling on my cheek and my split lip, and I watched something terrible happen behind his expression, his features going utterly still while his gray eyes turned to cold fire, a rage so controlled and absolute it made the air around him feel heavy. "Where is he?" Alexander asked, his voice quiet in a way that promised destruction, and I pointed toward the living room where Derek's snores continued undisturbed, and Alexander turned to the other man and said, "Nicholas, take Clara downstairs to the car," and the command was absolute. I hesitated, my feet refusing to move, because some part of me needed to know what would happen, needed to witness the moment my old life ended. But Alexander looked at me with those burning eyes and said, "I promise you, Clara, he will not follow you." And then softer, ever, and the certainty in his voice should have terrified me. This confirmation that he would do something irreversible and possibly unforgivable to Derek. But instead, I felt a wave of relief so powerful my knees almost buckled, because someone was finally going to make it stop. Nicholas turned out to be a man of few words, which I appreciated because I had none left in me, and he guided me down the narrow apartment stairs with a hand hovering near my elbow, never quite touching, but ready to steady me if I stumbled. And when we emerged onto the street, the black SUV waited like some sleek predator, windows tinted so dark I could not see inside. And he opened the back door and helped me in, with surprising gentleness, for someone built like he could break a person in half without effort. The interior smelled like leather, and something expensive I could not name, and Nicholas handed me a bottle of water and a small package of tissues without comment, just a brief nod before he closed the door and took position outside the vehicle, standing with his back to me, scanning the empty street, like threats might materialize from the shadows between the flickering streetlights. I sat in the silence and darkness and tried not to imagine what was happening 3 floors above me. Tried not to picture Alexander and Derek in that cramped living room with its stained carpet and broken blinds, but my mind conjured images anyway, violence playing out in flashes behind my eyes. And I pressed the cold water bottle against my split lip and told myself I did not care what happened to Derek, that he had made his choices and now faced the consequences. But guilt still twisted in my stomach because some part of me had been trained to feel responsible for male anger, trained to believe I caused the violence I received. I heard it then, voices raised and harsh filtering down through the building's thin walls. Derek's voice high and panicked, another voice too low and controlled to make out words, and then silence, heavy and absolute, the kind of silence that meant something had shifted, something had ended. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the water bottle, and I watched the building entrance with my heart hammering against my ribs, counting seconds that stretched into hours. And then Alexander emerged, just walking out the front door like he had simply paid a social call, his clothes unmarked, his stride unhurried, and even from a distance I could see his face was composed, almost serene, no evidence of whatever had transpired upstairs except for something dark and satisfied in his eyes, when Nicholas opened the door and Alexander slid into the back seat beside me. The driver, a silent figure I had not even registered before, started the engine without being told, and Alexander looked at me with those gray eyes that saw too much, and he said simply, "Go." And we pulled away from the curb, away from that building that had been my prison, and I finally found my voice and asked, "What did you do?" Needing to know, needing to understand what line he had crossed for me. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight, and then he said, "Derek received a clear message and a financial incentive to leave the city permanently. He will not bother you again," and his voice held such certainty, such absolute finality, That I knew whatever had happened in that apartment had been thorough and terrifying and probably involved threats I could not let myself imagine in detail. I should have felt guilty, should have felt afraid, should have questioned what kind of man solved problems with intimidation and violence, but instead I felt something else entirely. A lightness spreading through my chest, like I had been holding my breath for 2 years and could finally exhale, liberation so profound it made me dizzy. Alexander asked, "Where do you want to go?" And the question was simple. But the answer was impossible, because I had nowhere, no family who would take me in after I had ignored their warnings about Derek. No friends left after he had systematically isolated me from everyone who cared. No money for a hotel or apartment deposit. Nothing except the clothes in my duffel bag and the bruises on my skin. I admitted I have nowhere, and the words tasted like failure, and Alexander studied me in the dim light filtering through the tinted windows, the city sliding past outside, and he said I have a guest house on my property, separate space, fully secure. You can stay there just until you stabilize, figure out your next steps, and I understood what he was really offering, understood that accepting meant stepping fully into his world, the world of a man who could make other men disappear with a conversation and a financial incentive. But I also understood I was choosing this, choosing him, choosing whatever safety his dangerous protection could provide. And I said yes before I could second-guess myself, said I accept, and watched something shift in his expression, satisfaction and possession, and something almost tender. And he nodded once and told the driver an address I did not recognize, and we drove through the city toward whatever came next. The guest house turned out to be bigger than the entire apartment I had shared with Derek, bigger and more beautiful than anywhere I had ever lived in my 26 years. And when Alexander unlocked the front door and gestured me inside, I felt like I had stepped into some alternate universe where people actually lived like this, with gleaming hardwood floors and soft rugs that probably cost more than my car, with furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines, with windows that stretched floor to ceiling and showed a manicured lawn disappearing into darkness. Alexander moved through the space with easy familiarity, turning on lights, adjusting the thermostat, explaining things in that low, controlled voice that made me feel simultaneously safe and hyper-aware of his presence. And he showed me the security system with its sleek touchpad by the door, walking me through the code twice to make sure I had it memorized, telling me the system connected directly to his phone and to a private security company that would respond in under 3 minutes if I triggered the alarm. His main house was 100 yards away across the lawn, he explained, close enough if I needed him, but far enough to give me privacy, space to breathe and heal. And he would not intrude on that space unless I asked him to, and something about the way he said it made my chest tight, because when had anyone ever cared about my space, my needs, my boundaries? The kitchen was fully stocked, he continued, opening cabinets to show me dishes and glasses, opening the refrigerator to reveal more food than I typically had access to in a month. And his housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, would check on me tomorrow, bring anything I needed, and she was trustworthy and kind, and I should not hesitate to ask her for anything at all. I stood in the middle of this beautiful space with my pathetic duffel bag at my feet, and my split lip throbbing and my cheek swelling, and I finally asked the question that had been building since he pulled up to my apartment building like some dangerous avenging angel. Asked, "Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to me?" And Alexander went very still, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was deciding how much to tell me. And then he said simply that he recognized the look in my eyes because his mother had the same look before his father killed her when Alexander was 12 years old. And the words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs, because I understood then that this was not charity or pity or some kind of savior complex. This was personal. This was him seeing his mother in me and refusing to let history repeat itself, and tears burned behind my eyes because no one had ever looked at me and seen someone worth saving. Alexander told me to rest, to lock the doors, to know that these locks would actually keep me safe. And then he left, just walked out into the night toward his own house, and I stood there alone in the silence and luxury until my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the bed in the master bedroom. And I cried for the first time in months. Great shaking sobs that hurt my bruised ribs and made my split lip crack open again, crying for everything I had endured, and everything I had lost, and everything I might finally be able to become, now that someone had pulled me out of the darkness. I woke late in the morning to sunlight streaming through windows I had forgotten to cover, and for a confused moment, I did not know where I was, the softness of the bed and the silence of the room so foreign that panic spiked through me before memory returned in a rush. Alexander, Derek, escape, safety. And I lay there cataloging the unfamiliar ceiling and the absence of fear that had been my constant companion for so long. Someone had left a tray outside the guest house door, and when I opened it, I found breakfast still warm under covered dishes, pastries, and fruit and coffee that smelled like actual quality beans, and a note in elegant handwriting that read, "I hope you slept well. I will check on you this afternoon, Mrs. Pembroke." I carried the tray inside and ate slowly, tasting food for the first time in what felt like years, instead of just consuming fuel to survive. And then I forced myself into the shower, let hot water pound against muscles that ached from tension I could finally release. The mirror showed me damage I had been avoiding, my split lip healing but still swollen, my cheek bruised deep purple spreading toward my eye, finger-shaped marks on both arms in layers of yellow and green and fresh blue, ribs tender when I pressed them, and I stood there cataloging it all like evidence, proof of what I had endured and what I had finally escaped. I dressed in the softest clothes from my duffel bag, leggings and an oversized sweater that felt like armor against the world, and I explored the guest house properly in daylight, finding a library filled with books that looked read rather than decorative, art on the walls that seemed chosen for beauty rather than investment, comfortable spaces that invited rest, and I felt something in my chest loosen, because this was not a showplace, this was a home. Through the window, I saw Alexander's main house across the lawn, larger and more imposing, and movement caught my eye. Alexander himself visible through a window. On his phone, pacing with that controlled intensity I recognized, looking severe and powerful in ways that should have frightened me. And as I watched, he glanced toward the guest house like he knew I was there, and our eyes met across the distance, held for a moment that stretched and pulled tight. He ended his call abruptly, said something I could not hear, and then he was walking across the lawn toward me with purpose in every stride, and my heart started hammering because I did not know what this was, what we were, what happened now. He knocked on the door and I let him in, and he asked, "How did you sleep?" His gray eyes searching my face, taking in the bruises with an expression that made my breath catch, and I admitted better than I have slept in years, which was true. I had not woken once in terror or frozen in fear listening for footsteps. I watched him catalog my appearance the way I was cataloging his, the tailored shirt that fit him perfectly, the expensive watch, the controlled power he wore as easily as his clothes, and he asked if I was afraid of him, direct and unflinching, and I considered lying, considered saying no, but I had enough of lies and said yes, but not the way I was afraid of Derek, and I saw understanding flash in his eyes. Alexander appreciated my honesty in a way I could see in the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the softening around his eyes, and he moved further into the guest house, keeping a careful distance like he understood I needed space even as we talked about danger and protection and the reality of what his life actually was. He explained in that measured, deliberate voice that he ran security and logistics businesses, some legal and some less so, and he would not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise, would not dress up his empire in polite euphemisms. When the truth was, he controlled significant portions of this city through methods that existed in gray areas, and sometimes darker places than that. If I stayed here, even temporarily, people in his world and outside it would assume I was under his protection, and that designation would keep me safer than any restraining order or police intervention ever could. But it would also associate me with him, tie my name to his reputation, mark me as belonging to Alexander Tremayne in ways that could not be easily undone. She could leave any time, he continued, his gray eyes holding mine with absolute sincerity. And he would set me up with an apartment in a different part of the city, give me enough money to start over properly, create a fresh start somewhere far from both Derek and from him, and there would be no judgment in that choice, no resentment, just his genuine wish for my safety and happiness, whatever form that took. I found myself asking what happens if I stay, the question coming out quieter than I intended, and I watched something shift in Alexander's expression, his eyes darkening to smoke and steel, intensity radiating from him in waves that made my skin prickle with awareness. They would navigate that together, he said, his voice dropping lower, and the words felt like a promise and a warning and an invitation all at once, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and being asked if I wanted to jump. I felt a pull toward him I did not understand, could not explain, this dangerous, beautiful man who had shown me more respect and genuine care in the past 24 hours than Derek had managed in 2 years, who looked at my bruises with fury on my behalf rather than shame at what I had allowed, who offered me safety and choice and honesty when I had been living in lies and fear for so long. I told him I wanted to stay, at least until I figured out my next steps, at least until I could think clearly and plan properly and become someone who could stand on her own. And Alexander nodded slowly, something flickering in his eyes that might have been satisfaction or relief or want. He told me to rest, to recover, to let my body and mind heal in this protected space, and they would talk again soon. And then he was walking toward the door, and I watched him go with a strange ache in my chest because I realized something profound and terrifying. I felt safe here, truly safe, maybe for the first time since childhood, and that safety had nothing to do with security systems or locked doors, and everything to do with the man who had just walked out into the afternoon light. Over the next 3 days, I barely saw Alexander, except in glimpses through windows or across the lawn when he moved between buildings with that focused intensity that seemed to surround him like a force field. But evidence of his care was everywhere, woven into the fabric of my new temporary reality, in ways that made my chest ache with confusion and gratitude, and something I could not yet name. Mrs. Pembroke appeared like clockwork, with meals that were perfectly balanced and delicious, comfort food elevated to art, and she stayed to chat while I ate, her presence gentle and undemanding, asking nothing but offering companionship that felt like a lifeline after years of isolation Derek had carefully constructed around me. A doctor visited on the second day, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and competent hands, who examined my injuries with professional detachment but personal warmth, asking careful questions about pain levels and range of motion, prescribing cream for the bruises, and something to help me sleep without nightmares. And when I asked who sent her, she just smiled and said I was in good hands now. New clothes appeared in the guest house closet on the 3rd morning, my size exactly. Soft fabrics in colors I loved, but had stopped wearing because Derek said they made me look like I was asking for attention. And when I protested the expense to Mrs. Pembroke, she laughed and said Alexander was particular about protecting what was his. I objected immediately that I was not his, not anyone's. I had just escaped belonging to someone in the worst possible way, but Mrs. Pembroke gave me a knowing look that made heat crawl up my neck and said, "Whatever you say, dear," with an expression that suggested she saw right through my protest to the truth I was not ready to acknowledge. On day 4, Alexander invited me to dinner at the main house, and I changed clothes 3 times, nervous like I was going on a first date instead of crossing a lawn to eat with the man who had rescued me from hell, finally settling on a simple dark blue dress from the new clothes that made me feel pretty without trying too hard. The dining room was intimate rather than imposing, candlelit and warm, and Alexander stood when I entered, his gray eyes tracking over me with an appreciation that made my breath catch. and he pulled out my chair like I was someone worth this kind of careful courtesy. He poured wine, rich and red, and asked about my life before Derek, before the bruises and fear, and I found myself talking haltingly about dreams I had abandoned, the business degree I left unfinished when money ran out, the family who stopped speaking to me when I would not leave Derek the first time they noticed something was wrong, the person I used to be before I learned to make myself small and quiet and invisible. Alexander listened with complete attention, the kind of focus that made me feel like nothing else in the world existed except my words and the space between us. And for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Dinner became a regular occurrence, a ritual that anchored my days in ways I had not expected, and over the following week, we met each evening in that candlelit dining room where the outside world seemed to fade into insignificance, and all that existed was the space between us and the words we offered like fragile gifts. Alexander revealed pieces of himself in measured increments, his rise in the organization after his mother's death when he was still just a boy with rage and grief, and nowhere to put either except into survival and eventually into power, climbing ranks through intelligence and ruthlessness, but also through a code he developed early and never violated. Rules about never harming women or children, about keeping drugs out of schools, about protecting the people in his territory even as he controlled them. He spoke of enemies with cold assessment, rivals who respected boundaries and those who did not, allies who were trustworthy until they were not. The constant chess game of his world, where one wrong move could cost everything. I shared things I had never told anyone, the shame that lived in my chest about staying with Derek so long, about making excuses and believing promises, and returning again and again to someone who hurt me, the crushing weight of feeling stupid and weak and complicit in my own suffering. Alexander stopped me mid-sentence, his hand covering mine on the table, and said survivors do what they must to survive. There is no shame in that, only strength in the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of sitting across from him and speaking truth. Our conversations deepened with each passing night, moving from facts and history into philosophy and dreams, and I caught him watching me sometimes with heat in his eyes that made my skin flush and my breath catch, an intensity that was different from his usual controlled focus, something raw and hungry that called to an answering need I was only beginning to acknowledge in myself. One night, reaching for my wine glass at the same moment he reached for his, our hands touched, and the contact was electric, a jolt that traveled from my fingertips straight to my core, and neither of us pulled away. Alexander's thumb stroked along my wrist, gentle and deliberate over the faded bruises that were now yellow and green, healing marks that no longer hurt except in memory. And he asked in a voice rough with restraint if he could touch my face. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and his hand came up to cup my cheek, warm and calloused and impossibly tender, and I leaned into his touch like a plant turning toward sunlight. He murmured that I was beautiful, and the way he said it made me believe him, made me feel beautiful in a way I had not felt in years, maybe ever, because Derek's compliments had always come with conditions and criticisms attached. But Alexander's words felt like simple truth offered without expectation of anything in return. The moment shattered like dropped crystal when Alexander's phone buzzed against the table, harsh and insistent in the soft candlelit space we had created, and his expression shifted from tender to severe in a heartbeat, the business mask sliding into place with practiced ease as he glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened in a way that told me this was not something he could ignore. He apologized, voice rough with reluctance and what might have been frustration, said he had to handle this immediately. It could not wait, and told me to stay, finish the wine, make myself comfortable in his study if I wanted. He would return as soon as possible. I nodded, tried to hide my disappointment, watched him stride from the room with that focused intensity that transformed him from the man who touched me, like I was precious, into something harder and more dangerous, the duality of him both fascinating and unsettling. I moved to his study because sitting alone in the dining room felt too exposed, too vulnerable. And the study was all dark wood and leather, and the scent of him, books lining the walls, and a massive desk positioned to face the windows overlooking the grounds. I saw the photos on his desk almost immediately, drawn to them like they held answers to questions I had not yet learned to ask. Young Alexander, maybe 10 or 11, with a beautiful woman who had his eyes and his bone structure, her smile radiant, and her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of such casual affection that my heart ached looking at it, knowing what Alexander had told me about how she died. I heard raised voices outside, sharp and angry, cutting through the quiet night, and I moved to the window instinctively, looking out to see Alexander in the courtyard with a tall blonde man I had never seen before, their body language aggressive. The stranger gesturing wildly, while Alexander stood utterly still in that way that meant he was most dangerous. The man pointed toward the guest house, toward where I had been staying, toward me essentially, and even from this distance I could see the accusation in the gesture, the challenge. Alexander stepped into the man's space, close enough that it was clearly a threat, his posture radiating violence held on the thinnest leash, and the blonde man backed down immediately, hands raised in placation or surrender before he turned and walked quickly toward the front gates. Alexander stood there for a long moment after the man left, head bowed, hands clenched at his sides, before he turned and walked back toward the house with measured steps that spoke of iron control. He found me standing at the window when he entered the study, must have known I had seen everything, and his expression was unreadable when he asked if I was all right. I asked if I was causing him problems, if my presence here was creating complications he did not need, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear him say it. He said nothing he could not handle, dismissive in a way that did not invite further questions, but I pressed anyway, asked who the man was. Alexander hesitated, a pause that felt weighted with calculation about what to tell me and what to withhold, before he said, "That was James Crawford, his second in command, and he had concerns about outsiders, about security, about variables he could not control." I understood immediately that I was the variable, the outsider, the complication, and I offered to leave, to remove myself from the equation, even though the thought made something in my chest twist painfully. Alexander closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, crowding into my space, and said with absolute finality that I stayed. Tension stretched between us like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with potential energy and unspoken want, and I could feel the heat radiating from Alexander's body, where he stood so close that the space between us felt charged and dangerous in an entirely different way than the danger I had learned to recognize from his world. He asked in a voice low and rough if I understood what it meant to be under his protection, what it truly meant beyond the security and the guest house and the safety from Derek, and I said I was beginning to understand, that I saw how his men looked at me now, how James had come to assess whether I was worth the complication, how being associated with Alexander meant being marked as his, in a way that both sheltered and exposed me. He asked if that frightened me, if he frightened me, and I admitted that everything about him should terrify me. This man who commanded criminal empires and inspired fear in dangerous men, and had erased Derek from my life with a few quiet words, and probably violence I would never know the details of. But instead of fear, I felt safe for the first time in years, felt like I could breathe fully without waiting for the next blow. Something shifted in Alexander's expression when I said that. The iron control he maintained so carefully slipping just enough that I could see the raw need beneath it, the want he had been restraining out of respect for my healing and my trauma and the power imbalance between us. He stepped closer, closing the last inches of distance, and framed my face with both hands, his palms warm and slightly rough against my cheeks, his thumbs stroking gently along my cheekbones as he asked in a voice that shook slightly if he could kiss me. I whispered yes, barely able to force the word past the tightness in my throat and the hammering of my heart. And then his mouth was on mine, and it was nothing like kissing Derek. Nothing like the demanding, possessive way Derek had taken affection, like it was owed to him. Alexander kissed me like I was precious, like he was afraid I might break or disappear, gentle and reverent and seeking rather than taking, and I melted into him, my hands coming up to grip his shirt as my knees went weak with the overwhelming rightness of it. He pulled back after a long moment, resting his forehead against mine, both of us breathing hard, and said we should go slow, that I deserved courtship and consideration and time, not rushed intensity born from crisis and proximity. I laughed, the sound slightly breathless and edged with something like hysteria, and said that nothing about this situation was slow or normal, that I had moved into his guest house and into his life, and into his world in a matter of days, and slow had never been an option for us. His smile was rare and devastating, transforming his severe features into something almost boyish, and he agreed. Said slow was perhaps not our strong suit, and then he kissed me again, deeper this time, with less restraint and more hunger, and I responded with matching intensity, pouring into the kiss all the confused feelings I had been struggling to understand, the gratitude and attraction and growing certainty that this dangerous man was somehow exactly what I needed. Next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the guest house windows and the scent of roses filling the bedroom, and on the nightstand sat a crystal vase holding a dozen deep red blooms and a note in strong masculine handwriting that said he had business meetings all day, but I was in his thoughts and he would see me at dinner. I smiled, actually smiled in a way that felt unfamiliar on my face, like muscles remembering an expression they had forgotten, and I felt absurdly like a teenager with her first crush. Giddy and nervous and hopeful in a way that seemed ridiculous given the circumstances, but felt wonderful anyway. Mrs. Pembroke found me humming while making coffee in the guest house kitchen, and she gave me a knowing look, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed amusement as she said, I had a certain glow about me this morning, and she was happy to see it. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but could not stop smiling, and she patted my hand in that maternal way she had and said, Alexander deserved happiness, and perhaps I did too. I spent the morning helping Mrs. Pembroke with household tasks, needing purpose and activity to channel the restless energy humming through me. And she talked while we worked, sharing stories about Alexander, how she had come to work for him 15 years ago when he was just 19 and newly in charge of the family business, how fierce and brilliant and lonely he had been, how she had watched him build an empire but never let anyone truly close. In the afternoon I was reading in the guest house when a knock at the door made me tense, instinctive wariness flooding through me, because Alexander was gone, and I did not expect anyone. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw James Crawford standing on the doorstep, looking polite but serious. I opened the door slowly, keeping it partially closed, and he smiled, but it did not reach his eyes as he asked if he could have a few minutes of my time. He was polite, carefully so, but cold in a way that made clear this was not a social visit, and once inside he got straight to the point, said he needed to understand my intentions with Alexander. I bristled immediately, said that was between Alexander and me. None of his concern, but James shook his head and explained that everything involving Alexander was his concern because his job was keeping Alexander safe, and I was an unknown variable. He warned me that Alexander had enemies, serious, dangerous people who would not hesitate to use me to hurt him, that I was a liability whether I intended to be or not, and his eyes were hard when he said I needed to understand what staying meant. I stood firm despite my racing heart, lifted my chin and said, I never asked for any of this, but I was done running from fear, done making myself small to avoid danger, and if staying with Alexander meant risk, then that was my choice to make. James studied me for a long moment, reassessing, and something shifted in his expression before he nodded slowly and said, Maybe I was stronger than I looked. Maybe I would survive this world after all. He left without another word, but I stood shaking after the door closed, adrenaline flooding through me as I realized I had just been tested and apparently passed. But the encounter left me unsettled and frighteningly aware of how much I still did not understand about the life I was choosing. I told Alexander about James's visit that night over dinner, my hands wrapped around a wineglass for something to hold, as I recounted the conversation. And I watched Alexander's expression darken with each detail until fury sparked in his gray eyes, and his jaw tightened with barely contained anger. He said James overstepped, that he had no right to interrogate me or make me feel threatened in what was supposed to be my safe space, and I could see him calculating consequences and responses even as he spoke. I reached across the table and touched his hand, stilling the tension coiled in his fingers, and said that James was protecting him, doing what he thought necessary to keep Alexander safe, and maybe I needed to understand that kind of loyalty, even if it made me uncomfortable. Alexander turned his hand over to grip mine, said that was not James's call to make, that I was not a security threat to be assessed and managed, but someone under his protection, and increasingly more than that. I said I understood this world had rules I did not know, codes and hierarchies and protocols that everyone else seemed to grasp instinctively, and if I was going to stay, then I needed to learn them, needed to understand how to navigate the structure around him. Alexander studied me across the candlelight, his expression shifting from anger to something more searching and vulnerable, and asked if I truly wanted into his life, if I understood what that meant beyond the surface attraction and the safety he provided. I met his eyes steadily and said I wanted him, that the rest came with that choice, and I was making it with open eyes. He warned me it meant danger, that his enemies would see me as leverage and target, that it meant secrecy, because much of what he did could never be spoken about openly, that it meant moral compromise because his world operated in shades of gray, where right and wrong blurred into expedience and survival. I said I went from one cage with Derek to another kind of prison in the isolation and fear I had lived with, but this choice felt different because I was choosing it freely, choosing him and the life he offered with full knowledge of what it contained. Something flashed in his eyes, heat and possession and need all tangled together, and he stood abruptly and came around the table to pull me to my feet and then into his arms. He kissed me deeply, hungrily, with none of the careful restraint he had shown before, and I responded with matching intensity, my hands fisting in his shirt as I pressed closer. He lifted me easily, my legs wrapping around his waist as he carried me toward the stairs, and halfway up he stopped to pin me against the wall and ask again if I was sure, if this was what I wanted. I answered by kissing him harder, by pulling at his clothes with trembling hands, by whispering yes against his mouth until he groaned and carried me the rest of the way to his bedroom. Their intimacy was transformative in ways I had not anticipated, not just the physical connection, though, that was revelatory in itself, but the way Alexander touched me like I was something precious and breakable and worthy of reverence. His hands careful around my healing bruises, his mouth gentle against the fading yellow marks on my ribs. And I felt worshipped in a way that made tears prick my eyes, because I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with tenderness instead of ownership. Afterward, we lay tangled in his sheets, the expensive fabric cool against my overheated skin, and he traced idle patterns across my shoulder and down my arm, following the path of a bruise that had nearly disappeared, and he murmured that I was remarkable, that my strength amazed him, and I felt powerful in a new way that had nothing to do with physical capability and everything to do with being truly seen by someone who understood darkness. We talked deep into the night, our voices low and intimate in the cocoon of his bedroom. And he shared plans for legitimate business expansions he was working on, real estate developments, and security consulting contracts that could move more of his operations into legal territory. And I found myself offering suggestions from my abandoned business degree, ideas about market positioning and corporate structure that made his eyes light with interest. He listened, actually listened with the full weight of his attention, asked questions about my reasoning, incorporated my thoughts into his planning, and I realized with sudden clarity that I could have purpose here, that I did not have to be just the woman under his protection, but could be a partner in building something. Morning came too quickly, pale light filtering through the curtains, and Alexander kissed my forehead and said he had meetings with his organization leaders, important conversations about territory and alliances that could not be postponed. And then he surprised me by saying he wanted me to come with him, that it was time his inner circle met the woman who had become central to his life. My stomach fluttered with nerves as I dressed in clothes that felt too casual for meeting mob bosses, but Alexander assured me I was perfect, that I did not need to perform or impress anyone, that my presence itself made the statement he needed to make. We drove to a restaurant closed for private business, the kind of establishment that looked modest from outside, but inside was elegant and clearly secured, and in a back room sat 5 men who stood when we entered, their eyes immediately assessing me with the sharp attention of people whose survival depended on reading threats. Alexander introduced them by name and role: James Crawford, whom I had already met, Nicholas Romano, who had helped rescue me from Derek, and 3 others whose names and territories I tried to memorize, and they shook my hand with varying degrees of warmth but universal wariness. Alexander did not sit, instead stood with his hand on my lower back and made clear in concise words that I was not temporary, not a fling he would tire of, but someone under his full protection who had become integral to his life, and anyone who threatened me answered to him personally. The temperature in the room shifted, something settling as the men exchanged glances and then nodded their acceptance, and I understood with crystal certainty that I had just crossed a threshold, that there was no going back to the woman who delivered pizzas and dreamed of escape, because I had entered Alexander's world permanently and irrevocably. Weeks passed in a blur of integration and transformation as I found myself woven into the fabric of Alexander's life in ways that felt both natural and surreal, and he gave me real work managing the legitimate sides of his business empire, the security consulting firm, and the real estate holdings that operated in full daylight with proper contracts and legal structures. I proved myself capable quickly, my abandoned business degree finally finding purpose as I streamlined operations and identified expansion opportunities, and I watched the men who had assessed me with such wariness begin to nod when I spoke in meetings, to ask my opinion on deals, to treat me as more than just the boss's woman. Alexander and I grew closer with each passing day, the intensity between us deepening into something profound and unshakable. And he told me he loved me one night after a charity gala, where I had worn emerald silk and stood beside him as he networked with politicians and businessmen who pretended not to know the source of his wealth. I said it back without hesitation, because I meant it with every fiber of my being, and I saw the way his eyes softened with something like relief, as though he had feared I might not feel the same depth of emotion. But danger came as it inevitably does in his world, swift and brutal, and targeting the weakness everyone could see. I was taken from a parking garage 3 blocks from Alexander's office building, grabbed from behind as I walked to my car, a cloth over my mouth that smelled chemical and wrong, and I woke in a warehouse with my head pounding and my wrists zip-tied to a metal chair. My captor stepped into view, and my blood turned to ice because it was Derek, alive and smirking and clearly working with people who wanted to hurt Alexander through me. He said he had sold information about me to a rival organization, details about my routines and vulnerabilities, and they had paid him well while also offering him the revenge he craved after Alexander had driven him from the city. Fear spiked through me sharp and familiar, the old terror of being at Derek's mercy, but it was tangled now with fury because I had fought so hard to escape him and build something new. Derek gloated about how Alexander would have to trade territory and concessions to get me back, how this would cripple the Tremayne empire, and I laughed bitterly, despite my split lip, because he had no idea what he had started. I told him Alexander did not negotiate with people who took what was his, that Derek had just signed his own death warrant, and I watched uncertainty flicker across his face before rage replaced it. He hit me hard across the face, and I tasted blood again, that familiar copper tang. But I did not break or beg, because I was not the same woman he had terrorized, and I knew with absolute certainty that Alexander was already coming for me. And gunfire erupted outside the warehouse in sharp staccato bursts that made Derek's head snap toward the sound, his bravado crumbling into panic as he realized Alexander had not come to negotiate, but to wage war. And I watched Derek's hand shake as he pulled a gun from his waistband and pressed the cold metal against my temple, his voice high and desperate as he screamed that he would kill me if anyone came closer. The warehouse door exploded inward with a boom that reverberated through my bones, and Alexander walked through the smoke and chaos like an avenging angel, alone with his hands visible and empty. But his face was death itself, all cold fury and lethal promise, and I had never seen anything more terrifying or more beautiful. Derek's gun pressed harder against my skull as he shouted that Alexander needed to back off, or I would die, that he wanted guarantees of safe passage and money and a dozen impossible things. But Alexander's voice, when he spoke, was calm and certain as a blade, telling Derek to let me go and he could walk away, that this did not need to end in more bloodshed. Derek laughed wildly and said he was not stupid enough to believe that lie, that Alexander would hunt him forever, and I felt the tremor in Derek's body behind me, fear and desperation making him unpredictable and more dangerous. Alexander's eyes found mine across the space between us, and I saw the message there as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud, the slight tilt of his head and the focus of his gaze telling me to trust him, to be ready, and I understood with perfect clarity what needed to happen. I threw my weight backward suddenly, the chair tilting on its back legs, and Derek's gun jerked away from my head as he tried to compensate for the shift, and in that fraction of a second, Alexander moved with deadly precision, his hand producing a weapon I had not seen, and firing once with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times before. Derek dropped like a puppet with cut strings, the gun clattering across concrete, and I hit the ground hard, still tied to the chair, pain radiating through my shoulder and hip. But I was alive and Derek was not. Alexander was beside me in an instant, his hands steady as he cut through the zip ties with a knife that appeared from somewhere, his fingers gentle as they touched my face and checked my injuries, cataloging the new bruises Derek had added to my collection, and I was shaking so hard my teeth chattered, but I managed to tell him I was okay. He pulled me into his arms right there on the filthy warehouse floor, held me against his chest where I could hear his heart racing despite his outward calm, and he promised in a voice rough with emotion that no one would ever hurt me again, that he would burn the world down before he let anyone take me from him. I believed him with every cell in my body. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, but Alexander's expression did not change as he helped me to my feet, his arm supporting me as we walked out of the warehouse past the bodies of men who had thought they could use me as leverage, and Nicholas was waiting with the SUV, his face grim but satisfied. Alexander told me quietly that everything was handled, that the police would find a kidnapping victim rescued by private security, self-defense, and justifiable force. All the pieces already in place before he had even breached the warehouse, and I marveled at the reach of his power and planning. We drove home through city streets that looked surreal in their normalcy, people going about ordinary lives while I sat covered in blood that was not mine, and Alexander kept his hand on my knee the entire drive, grounding me, reminding me I was safe. When we finally walked through the door of his house, our house, I broke down completely, the terror and adrenaline draining away and leaving me hollow and shaking. And Alexander carried me upstairs and held me in the shower as warm water washed away the physical evidence of the nightmare, his quiet reassurances more healing than any medicine. Later, wrapped in soft clothes in his bed, I realized with absolute certainty that home was not a place anymore but a person, and that person was Alexander Tremayne, dangerous and deadly and completely mine, just as I was irrevocably and permanently his. The aftermath settled over us like dust after an explosion. And in the days and weeks that followed Derek's death and the dismantling of the rival organization that had thought they could use me as leverage against Alexander, I found myself recovering both physically and emotionally in ways I had not thought possible. Alexander never left my side during the healing process, canceling meetings and delegating responsibilities so he could be present as I worked through nightmares and sudden panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds or movements. And his steady presence became my anchor in a way that made me understand the difference between dependence born of fear and partnership built on choice. I came to understand the full scope of his world during those months, the violence and moral complexity that existed beneath the surface of legitimate business operations, and I accepted it with clear eyes because I was not a naive victim anymore, but rather a partner to a dangerous man who had shown me more respect and care than anyone in my previous life ever had. I helped expand the legitimate operations with genuine enthusiasm, applying my business knowledge to real estate acquisitions and security consulting contracts, while understanding that the shadows underneath funded and protected everything we built in the light. Alexander proposed 3 months after the kidnapping on an ordinary Tuesday evening, as we sat on the terrace watching the city lights spread below us like scattered diamonds, and the ring he offered was simple and perfect, a single emerald flanked by diamonds that caught the light like captured fire. He asked me to marry him and share his life completely, all of it, the empire and the danger and the future we would build together. And I said yes without hesitation, because I had already chosen this path the moment I texted him for help from my locked bedroom. We married quietly with just the inner circle present in the garden behind his house, Mrs. Pembroke crying happy tears as she watched me walk toward Alexander in a dress of ivory silk that made me feel like someone entirely new, and James stood as best man and toasted to me afterward, admitting in front of everyone that he had been wrong about me, that I belonged here in ways he had not anticipated, and I saw genuine respect in his eyes. On our wedding night, Alexander held me close in the darkness of our bedroom and told me that I had saved him as much as he had saved me, that I had given him something beyond the empire he had built from blood and necessity, a reason to imagine a future that included more than territory and power. I responded that I had found myself in his protection, discovered strength I had not known I possessed, and together we had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or safe, but we were perfect together in our imperfection. Two damaged people who had recognized something essential in each other that first night, when a pizza delivery to the wrong address had changed both our lives forever, and the future stretched before us dangerous and uncertain, but utterly ours to claim and defend and shape into whatever we chose to make it.